Today we have Nandita Kumar, who's an artist, sound artist as well, installation artist, and well, I will ask soon Nandita to describe her practice for us. So today we'll talk about her work with digital scores and yeah, basically how did she come to work in this medium. So Nandita, thanks so much for joining us today with the Digital Score Project. And Nandita is in Goa, India, is that right?
Yes, I am indeed. Thanks for inviting me. It's almost, I think, I just had a sunset here and I look forward to this. So go ahead and ask me any question and what would you like me to actually communicate on?
Great. So, yes, so can you tell us a little bit about your background and how did you come to work with plants, biomaterials, sound, and installation with digital scores as well?
Uh, Sort of, I think it was a step-by-step process. I got into sound because of filmmaking. So I did my master's in something called experimental animation and film, and started sort of developing, uh, the Foley sounds for the animation and collaborating with a lot of artists. And sort of that's what sort of spinned me into working a lot in the direction of sound. Actually, also the way the films are created in like in terms of collaboration and working, with larger groups of people, and it's not like an isolated artistic experience. I sort of took that in and sort of just started developing my own structure within the visual arts sphere once I sort of started when I moved back to India. But sound's always been a part of my life. I wanted to be a musician, but landed up in visual arts. I was very good with coding and programming, but I never really got a combination as such to create something like that, to actually in universities in India when I was a student. And I think all these quests and desires, I slowly just started like, I was working in different streams, like in community art projects, working in tech, visual art development, film. All of this were like all separate streams of engagement. And then slowly, when I moved back to India, I started sort of unifying all these elements. But also, I think the first thing that hit me after like moving back into this country after almost a decade was how much the living ecology in the cities, such as Bombay and Delhi, had drastically changed since I was a child. Um, I actually used to swim. That's what I use as an example in the waters in Bombay as a young kid. And now I can't even put my foot in there because, it's toxic. It's full of sewage. And so when you walk into a living ecology and you see how fast the regression has taken place, I think I just sort of it sort of propelled me to work in a space where I was like, someone has to start documenting and archiving and talking about all the complexities of environmental issues and ecologies and the deep networks there are. And I think I built my first piece in 2011, sort of a sound installation, which was called Element Earth. It was based on biomimicry. I sort of was drawn to sound and tech because I felt like technology had a sort of a seduction to it. It was easy to use, and the viewership, like, at that point, everybody would like to, I'm talking about 2010, 11, and mobile phones had just sort of gushed into the market. And I had worked on a community art project in Dharavi, which is considered one of the largest slums in Asia. And I sort of started seeing like some of the NGOs were using mobile phones to collect data and tech, and they were teaching the women uh, to actually collect data. And it's sort of, I mean, I was just observing at that point all these things that were sort of transpiring, but I was also looking at a very vast spectrum of audience in India, not just seeing it from a very art and niche perspective. It was like, how do you outreach? Like, how does, if I make a piece, how does it communicate to everyone with coming from different backgrounds, different education or the lack of educational resources, but still make it pretty universal and acceptable, like, accessible, sorry, not acceptable. Um, and I found like motion-based sensors, all of this pretty much like people moving around, activating different sounds, and using storytelling, which I use a lot in filmmaking, to actually communicate the larger issues. So when people started interacting and I would communicate what the piece was about, it propelled a lot more questions. And that sort of propelled me to make my first go, which was based on the data of the sun. And I basically, made a little chart, like which like stated what these data sets were about. But when I displayed this piece, because sound art in the visual art field, how would you say in India, everything's based, like, the market runs it quite a bit. There's a private market. And so everyone was like, okay, they were quite surprised that people were so interested and they had so many questions that, and I would be standing next to this work, it was 126.22 hertz. And I would be explaining what each data set meant. And then I realized like people are actually curious and want to know things. And so I started consolidating and building these knowledge data sets, which I researched to build the scores out of. So I started building like graphical notation scores out of data sets. And then consolidating them in book format, because I realized I was there maybe 5% of the time in front of the work or near the work. And so for the curious ones, how exactly like one would like, if I'm not present, how do you actually communicate that? And so there were baby steps. And when I moved from Bombay to Goa, and I'm actually living in the midst of a paddy field. So there's a big paddy field, like a kilometer worth. And I started falling sick a lot after it. And this was happening by the end of being in Bombay and moving here. And I started sort of like looking at alternative medicines in Goa. I started looking at weeds, which were like discarded from the agriculture because it was not considered the correct plant, or dangerous to the growth of a industrialized crop that is recognized, the 40-odd crops that our food is dependent on. So I started looking, because of my own health issues, I started sort of seeking different plants around in a walking distance of, say, 20 minutes, and collecting all this data set and looking into the medicinal properties, food properties. I started imagining cities where anyone who had the knowledge could just grow their own medicines, because it was fascinating. Each plant had around 20 to 30 properties, which could be used as medicinal food, or like, used for making mats or like lamps or things like that, And I was just like, what if people could walk out, or in the little tiny balconies in Bombay, people could grow plants, or on the railway tracks, grow their food. How could information and knowledge, be used to create a dialogue and look at the future? I try to look at it in a more utopic lens. I mean, India has degraded at a very fast pace. From what I've witnessed as a child and as an adult, the rampant growth. And I think it's a constant conversation with my living ecology and observations, and converting those living ecologies to sonic sounds. and looking at different ways of how, because I feel like sometimes like more than words, more than reading a lot of data or books, I feel sound can carry so much information from a distance and arouse so much curiosity and can reach a really wide spectrum of audience from like a child to a really old person. And and arouse a dialogue as such. There is this two back and forth that is sort of happening.
Great.
And so these are the choices sort of that led to some of the things that I've been exploring.
Great. That's really fascinating. This is really interesting because it seems like you want to create meaningful experiences for the viewer with the things that are kind of abstract, like scientific data, and you find this way through sound. So I guess I'm curious to know, so what is underneath that kind of desire? Is it communication, do you think, or I don't know, kind of making
the main desire is to have sustainable cities, landscapes.
Right.
To not lose, lose the water or lose the earth and the beautiful fireflies around me. It's the desire for us to live sustainably, and witnessing like large farmlands being converted to malls or large landscapes, or the trees being cut to for the idea of what development means. I think part of me is just sort of to generate these conversations to get the larger masses thinking and preparing some sort of conversation around these spectrums, which has been completely lacking. Most of it sort of, you see a lot, obviously, get these pop-ups in media, which sort of comes in, and I've sort of noticed over the years it's increased more, of course. But simultaneously, there is a large group of people who don't read and write in India. There's at least 30%, now it's 35% of the populace. So, I feel like, okay, my neighbor is like a farmer, and I have these conversations with him. We sort of talk about like how, deforestation and the football ground being created is draining the water and like sort of resulting in all the snakes and the different kinds of migrations happening within the local community. And so when I have these conversations, how weather and how it's influencing these, growth of the plants, and whether, we had this time very extreme rainfall and dryness within the monsoon season. And part of it was we were all worried whether the crops would survive. So when you have these conversations, you realize like there's a lot of fragility, and the networks are super sensitive. So when it's like a string in a guitar or a sound instrument, and when you play it, it's sort of, there's a ripple effect that sort of happens through time and space. And part of me is like hoping for a little ripple effect through what I'm doing, so that at least I can bring about 0.0000001% change of some sort. And so that's what I hope from these works.
Great. And it seems like accessibility is a big part of why you actually started initially working with like mobile and this kind of score communication idea. Is that, am I correct? It's like the idea that anyone can access
have environmental stories in the form of a score. So each score representing a different story and opening different gateways and dimensions and directions to different information paths. I saw it as a great archive. So if I had all the tech in hand, I could actually create giant library systems just based on these graphical notation scores, which would contain a lot of data set. It makes it more organic in the way one would explore it, which increases the number of incidences and overlaps and patterns to generate through the process. And because of the site, because you're giving ownership of creativity through interaction to the interactor, it sort of, I'm hoping these systems can sort of, trigger certain kinds of memories, certain kinds of, associations and learning curves also sort of using like intuitive methodologies of touch, and like I'm developing this web app, which is made of the data of water, and I've been sort of working on it since
Yeah, I
2017.
saw it in your files. Yeah.
And I'm still working on it. So it's a tedious process. It's a big process because I had to learn how to actually went down till the data level, cleared out, worked with a lot of different sort of people coming from different backgrounds, from scientists to biotechnologists to ocean scientists, I meant, and they're looking through the data and sort of showing me like how to clean up the data. That the data was sort of programmed, constructed into images, sounding it, creating it into something compressible and on the web, and keeping it sort of within the folds of it. It sort of was trying to attempt at a system design. And I would still say this is still an experiment because I'm learning as it goes out, and I engage with the viewer and then I learn. And with that feedback, I'm able to design a better system. So I would say I'm a system designer and using like graphical notation scores as entry points into these systems because of their intuitive abilities and organic, overlaps that can happen.
So are these graphic scores, they're for the public as well as for musicians sometimes, right? So for the public, they're more like a narrative of the work in a way that they can interactively go into these worlds. But for the musicians, I was curious, how does collaborating with musicians or hearing their interpretation change for you your understanding of the work?
Well, I feel like one of the reasons why I even collaborate is because I feel like environmental issues are not just a one-man job. It sort of has a notion where you need like people to be like bees in hives to actually work towards a problem together. And so my collaborators are actually, they're inputting their knowledge and they're coming in different forms. So when I feel like this give and take that happens, like I create a structure and let them enter, and the freedom that I would give them within that structure and the engagement that takes place, I learn something from that process of engagement. So whether it is sort of like, like for example, like I've been working on converting pollutants to um, sound frequencies. And so I've done a mathematical equation where I've converted the compounds, the energy that is released in the creation of the compounds, or the breakdown of it, and I've converted it into a sound. But they're 42 pollutants, and their frequencies are super close. And so we've been discussing like, but they almost sound the same. Like how does one distinguish from one another because of the way the data sets are? And that's how, when you're converting something which is completely inaudible and then bringing it to an audible range, the spectrum is not very wide. And so it's, when it comes down to conversion, then these dialogues sort of start coming in. How do you make the invisible visible? Or sonically visible.
Yeah, I noticed it's one of the themes in your work.
Yeah. And I just sometimes I feel like I may not even come up with great solutions, but my collaborators might come up with more unique solutions in converting this. And I think it's just these dialogues which completely enriches me, and I can sit in a village and still feel stimulated. And most of my collaborations, even before pre-pandemic, have been happening online, and I've been working with people from different countries as well as within India from different states. So
So it reveals some sort of new kind of perspectives for you on the work, and also it is kind
in a
of
way, yes, but also you have to see
spirit
like,
of the
okay,
work.
there are different people from different knowledge backgrounds coming, whether they are like people from, they're science-based backgrounds. I'm learning every day something like coders, programmers. So, I mean, I feel like each project becomes like a mini thesis for me. So, and so they can take up to 2-3 years of me just developing, writing, creating the book, like simplifying like the data sets, making it accessible in a book format, converting heavy science, then understanding what's happening. I like when I was doing the water project. Basically, I took tuitions and I studied with a PhD student who was working on water, and he's a biochemist who's also interested in sound. So it was really interesting for me to I invite different sort of people, and there is this exchange happening. And I think that is what is the most stimulating part, because it's sort of putting people into different peripheries of thinking, and then what sort of emerges out of, and how data can be used in so many different ways. I'm mutating the same data, so book format and a sound format and an installation format, and giving the audience also multiple entry points. But simultaneously, when I'm engaging, I'm also really understanding whether that language is clear, because you have all these people coming from different backgrounds. So when these discussions take place, and then if something is not understandable or accessible, it becomes evident in the dialogues which are happening during the research phase. Because there are multi-brains coming in. Not multi-grains, but brains, yeah.
Multi-greens.
Yeah, multi-brains.
To use the analogy from nature. Interesting. So yes, I guess it's important for you that other collaborators are just as engaged with the work, and for you it's very important to test it, be it on viewers or other collaborators, interdisciplinary collaborators. Sorry. So just for our viewers, could you just tell us a little bit more about like the context in which you are working in terms of exhibitions, performances, any other?
Well, I did my first performance this time at the gallery with the Mertz Music Festival. So, live. I think mostly I've been working with like field recordings and, working with different musicians would give certain layers and then sort of post-edit, sort of combine most of this. But this was the first time I sort of thought I should I am in Berlin and I should be able to, I should put my fingers into the into this space. And it was definitely very fascinating for me to work and try to coordinate with humans in the same time and space, because the digital reality gives you like expansiveness, because people can like input as and when they feel like. So the spectrum is completely different. But here, because people, so one was, I think for me that was the challenge, just to get all these wonderful people in the same room to actually work on the project together. But I worked on, I don't know if if you read on that project, Paradigm to Paradigm into the Bionic Time, where I collected like 91 political statements, and then I put them into code, and each statement became with the same words, constructed into a haiku format. Now these haikus actually create the 4-channel sound experience as well as a live performance. And the haikus were vocalized by 3 voice extension artists. One of them was Ute Wasserman, and Alex Novets and Kristen Kesten. And then I collected a lot of waste objects with Merche Blasco, and she basically, all these 91 statements were divided into 5 elements, which was earth, water, fire-based issues, and void becoming law. So she created the weather out of the waste, using these objects. And the third layer would be like by Felicity Mangan, who I'd sort of collected all these sound bites of the internet. So every statement, whatever information, foley sounds, I could find, like news or whatever, anything was vocalized regarding that information, news article, news to, I sort of created a whole archive of sounds, and then sort of, handed it over to her so she could pick and choose what she felt like, and sort of creating a healthy balance between some sort of news and foley, because obviously I couldn't travel to all these places and do field recordings. So it's also like looking at how you could connect and through sound, and this sort of landed up in a live performance, which was quite exhilarating for me. I mean, people have a tendency of asking me like whether I would perform, but I make machines. I'm an absent performer. I'm a shy performer, so I prefer making like objects that actually do the workings for me, or musical instruments, or like, and how would I say it? I would like to do more performances. I feel like there is a more directness to it. And I mean, I feel like the chance of chaos enters in more. And I really like the process of chance entering into all my scores, which is the fundamental basis on which all of this lies. And sort of regurgitating patterns, but sort of never repeating identical ever. And sort of finding these methodologies of glitches and errors, becoming the inception from where sound is actually created.
So kind of working with constant kind of generation of what the materials already imply, sort of.
Yeah, and it's also constantly like, I worked for the Sound Biennale, and that was an online sort of the same data changes, and when it's given to different people in different hands, because the correlation to their data changes, just like in graphical notation scores. And sort of every time I've sort of collaborated, it's brought in a new sonic engagement, which gets like like Merche Blasco actually had created these little thimbles, finger thimbles made out of copper wire, where she basically could read the EMF frequencies. And so all the found electronic objects, she gave them another life through sound, which was very fascinating for me.
And your score allowed her to explore this, or?
Yeah. I mean, she already had created it. So, I mean, I was looking for someone who could do Foley, like live Foley performance. And I think Merche, who's another Diadi fellow at that point, sort of jumped in when she saw the project. And she was like, I've been wanting to do this. And I was like, okay, And I said, this is what I was thinking, was like if we could find like different objects and sonify and use waste, like, from the kitchen, the plastic bottles that came out, or glass bottles, or like old typewriters, mud, sound, leaves, plastic, water itself, like she, ice, she used like multi-layered sort of spectrum with different elements portraying them. So definitely, and I gave them like complete freedom how to interpret it within the set conceptual structure.
Great. Great. And actually, you mentioned earlier working with frequencies of plants, and that's really interesting. I haven't heard of this method before, but basically you kind of find the frequency of a plant and go with it. But how do you find the frequency of the plant?
No. So basically, my longtime collaborator, Kerry Ray Seekins, we met at CalArts, and we've been working for quite a few projects together. And so at the time I was doing the plant project, she was doing a course in San Francisco, where they were teaching how to, through using intuitive methodologies, how you could extrapolate like sound frequencies from organic objects. See, it's relatively easy to find frequencies of glass and wood, and because they're dead objects. But when it's organic, it's a far more complex system. So what she told me was like this scientist who had sort of taught them these different methods. There were two ways of which she entered through it. One was through my field recordings from where the plants were collected. So she got the range in which the plants were existing. The second one was basically she used the second layer was once she had got the range was by using these intuitive methodologies which she learned, where I believe like a group of 20 people would sit in that workshop and say, for example, touch an apple, and without talking to one another, they would all come up with the same frequency. So I found it really fascinating. I could also have used an MRI scan and then converted the image into a sound, but I found this human interrelationship with an organic object in order to come up with this intuitive
Yeah.
understanding of a sound frequency to be very interesting, because I actually use a humidity sensor in that piece, which the sound modulates with the change in humidity of a space in that sound sculpture. So towards these frequencies, which sort of also brings about these invisible correlations which humans and plants have, which are lying, which are underlying in between and activating those correlations, right? And so I sort of decided to work using this method, which I found it was like, I would say like, I wouldn't say like purely scientific in the current definition of what science is, because I think that is also propelling and changing. But there is definitely a logical, an inherent logic in this methodology, which was fascinating for me, and I used it with Kerry, who basically I sent the beads illegally to the US to her, and then she basically pulled out all the frequencies and constructed the sound for it.
Wow. Yeah, it's really fascinating because it's kind of a process that is entangled with humans and the nature, the environment where the plants are, right? So it's so I find that actually in all of your work, that's kind of one of the concerns, is the how is everything related and how are we influencing each other, and
it's like a seamless flow between the tech, the human, the plant. It's like I feel energy is constantly flowing around. Energy is sound, energy is like all forms of life in some form, and in the same way, I just try to capture that little bit aspect of that space through like sort of it's like a narrative. It's like this seamless flow of energy where the glitches of a tech become the inception for making the sound, a sound score, in which the humans are intuitively analyzing it. So I've always liked that nexus where sort of there is like, you can't make out whether it's human based work or tech based work, or like it has that it has that ephemeral quality, which is sort of it's a process driven piece, and it sort of evokes, because we can't negate technology, we are surrounded by it. It's there, it sort of it shapes the way we think now, it moves the way we process information, and it's polluting, it's affecting the environment, and the same way we sit in cities and sort of design this technology, which is basically humans which are so disconnected from their natural ecology are actually creating objects which are also disconnected. So in a way, if you start processing all this information, I see all of this is material to actually communicate, talk. Why circuit boards? Because it's the inherent brain in every object within our current technological spectrum. Copper is like alchemy in a way. It's an alchemical a metal. On the same end, it's the conduit of information,
that comes from Earth.
electricity, knowledge, and it comes from Earth. So, and the metamorphosis that's taking place, how this material actually travels from the Earth and sort of takes this cycle and comes into the human reality, and then still sort of we are unable to complete the cycle like all natural living ecology, which is far more intelligent and can complete a circular economy. I feel like these are the dialogues that actually emerged out of the work that is being created, because it's also constantly metamorphosizing and changing changing to its environment, changing to like how sound changes. I mean, in every space it sort of brings about a whole different sonic experience. How it bounces off the wall, if there is a wall.
Sorry, does every work kind of reveal to you something new about technology and our correlation in nature to it? Does it give you some new insights?
I think we're very much aware as a species, like, of what we are doing. I
Mm.
think for me, it's mostly about like, I think one of the things that I've learned is like just to observe, like just to go on a walk and look at things, look at the sunset, look at the plants,
Mm.
look at like how, uh, whether it's like the death, the process of death, say a dead frog with all the ants on it,
Mm.
um, animating it to a certain extent. Because the more you observe, I think you're able to then find a language with it, which you're able to
Mm.
evoke. It has its story. I think it's finding the story. Whether it's a technological object, like I love old technology because they come with all their issues.
Mm.
um, but when you observe a machine and then it sort of just communicates, I'm sometimes sitting with machines for like 2 to 3 years, 4 years, because I don't know what to do with them.
Mm.
And suddenly, I'm able to build all these associations, because things that have been like running in my brain, because I've been like with the political statements, which I collected, suddenly like in Goa, like 6, 7 years back, coconut was declared as no longer a tree. And I was
Mm.
amused by it. And there's a lot of like false or uh, sort of information that is traveling in space and time, which is making the ecology murky, I would say polluted in its own way, the data pollution that takes place.
Mm.
And I think once you hear truly from your senses, I mean, social media, everything is a mass distraction after appointments. You truly sit and hear and observe. It gives birth to a lot of ideas and stories. And you have to find that story within that entity itself. That's what I'm just trying to say.
Great. So like finding the story within what is being communicated to you through
Yeah,
nature
and story
or
just
the
not is
language.
oral. Yeah,
Yeah, the
language,
language.
stories, so sonic. Yes,
Mm.
they're like these
And relating it to
associations.
technology
Yes, in a way,
in a way.
because
Yeah. Simply
yeah,
simply put. But yeah, actually it's very complex when you start to think about it, really. But I find it amazing how you kind of like to bring it like this kind of translatable uh points of it to the public. So that's is it hard to kind of discern what you're going to focus on to communicate?
no, I think that's one thing that I'm clear. I think I'm like I've got the ideas.
Mm.
It's just I think when it comes down to actually producing them, they can take really long. So it's always
Mm.
a negotiation between time and the attention span that I can give it. Like how long can I last with this project?
Mm.
I need to last. Because it's like that's the interest and how much I feel strongly for it. It's like the water project was like came deep out of a deep sense of loss because the same ocean where I swam, I could no longer swim without getting allergies.
Mm.
The red crabs had become black crabs because the water is black.
Mm.
I mean, when it really comes down to very basic things, which trigger and uh, I mean, when you're sitting in a population of 1.4 billion people, it's also figuring out how to voice out, that noise
Mm.
and still communicate, but not aggressively. Find your own subtle methodologies and natural
Mm.
ways of putting out sound.
Mm.
Because otherwise, I'll just be like another Bollywood film, like, giving the exact,
Mm.
if it's a tense situation, you have sort of like a theatrical sort of moment. And that is not what I'm seeking. I'm sort of trying to seek like how in calmness and still uh, uh,
Mm.
like reducing time and increasing the space through sound to actually slow down things so people can actually immerse themselves and through their curiosity or level of curiosity actually indulge in the amount of
Mm.
information being offered, and keep going back at it and
Mm.
keep making it accessible. And that's why the different forms are extremely important,
Mm.
because sometimes artworks can get sold and lie in storages,
Mhm.
you know. So how do you escape that? Or even sound can get locked up in a certain spectrum. So like, having sonic books,
Mm.
so sort of blending a lot of different kinds of strategies to actually overlap them and make them like conducive and accessible, because I think, and that's one of the reasons why I choose also to speak in plain simple language, because part of the issue has been language plays such a huge role in the way you are communicating, and to be understood is for me extremely vital, because that's what the work is about. It's transference of knowledge and data, and
Yeah.
all the research that I've had the privilege of being able to spend time with and learn.
Yeah, that's great. That's really fascinating. That is very important to you, and the meaning that the public makes with your work, how they enter into it, and that you present many different options as well. That it's not just through sound; it could be through books or tactile media. It's really great. Well, is there anything else you would like to mention in today's interview about your work and
I mean, I
everything we
had a
talked about?
question for you. Is there anything specific you want to ask about the work?
Oh, about work, the works that you made. Well, I found it interesting, the big water project, how you related to different kind of narratives and stories to do with bad environmental issues like pollution in some cases, and also extinction. Sorry. Yeah, it just seems like really. I'm really curious how you decided to take this approach of this big kind of archival work with the score, the interactive platform. But were you always thinking that it's going to be kind of a multi-dimensional thing, or were you thinking about this will be like just just an exhibition where people can come and interact, or did it grow over time?
It grew over time, definitely, like all things do. But I definitely didn't know I was making a score which was based on different water-related issues, and it was based on finding good data sets. And it's not geographically located. I mean, it's sort of the journey is of water from space to the ocean, and there's 7 chapters which actually take on different topics. And why space? Because actually water is older than Earth. In the first chapter, we're discussing how the construct of the basic molecule actually shapes a lot of the things which are based on this planet. Whether it's how our genetics, or our gene is sort of defined and twisted and turned because of the way the water holds the proteins which are holding our gene. And sort of traveling into from there, I sort of travel into the atmosphere and seeing how the correlation of carbon in the atmosphere affects water. And so what I did was attach different case studies, and then the river came, and then the ocean came, and I attached different case studies related to river pollution. And it's designed like a giant piano in the web app. So initially I wanted it to be like augmented reality, like a lot of people were thinking. But then I started realizing augmented reality was only available on really expensive phones.
It's still a bit limited, yeah.
And so the access of technology is another question that one has to ask, is why am I is it this new in thing, or am I really trying to use it for something that is going to spurt into something? So I decided actually to go for the most basic thing, which is like a web app, which is like a website in a way, and it can be opened as an app on the phone. And I wouldn't be bound to any particular kind of phone, because once you start developing into this, it's like, okay, it comes with too many limitations. And so I wanted it to be completely organic, free flowing through all the possible technologies. So this score can actually be blown up as a mural, and people on the streets can pick it up with a QR code and access the app. There is a book being written with the 7 chapters, which talks about deeper correlations and how these data sets are interconnected. And I'm writing this with an environmental journalist, and she's known as Supriya Vora. So we've been at it also for 5 years. And the thing was also like, Pompidou invited this, though it fell through for all other reasons. So they wanted to put it on their glass wall so it could be accessed from within the museum and outside, because there was such a huge walking crowd outside the museum. I think it's considered one of the busiest streets in Europe. And so
in Paris,
and
right?
in India,
Yeah, Pompidou Art Center in Paris, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I've been sort of developed this, but part of it was also like I wanted it to go down to every street. Like, you could put it in, I could go and stick it as a poster, these with a QR code. And the idea was that I could just go around, even if I had little money, I could just paste these things randomly, like posters in India. You can do this illegal posting in a lot of places, and but let it go down on the street and make it accessible. And I was hoping, as I get more and more money for this, to develop this app, I can go into different regional languages. And the sound just being like a conduit, like, because if people don't read, they may speak the language, but they don't read, they can still access some of it and introduce it to their kids, introduce it to someone, and it spreads. So the idea was just to build a system which could perpetuate and flow through, and that was one of the things that I was really interested in, to experiment. So I think we've just started on mobile phones, which is very recent. So I'm hoping, like, I want to sort of maybe launch this in public art spaces and, off the grid sort of systems. That's what I've been doing, and to see its viability. I always see all my systems as a testing module space, and I sort of develop more and more through the interaction. But it's a mutable. So there's a sculpture. The sculpture can be put in the museum. You can access the app. The book can be put. You have the app accessibility through the book. You can have a mural. So no one really owns the design per se. No one owns the score. It's a fluid design which can go into all these different spaces and access like different spectrums of audience and not get trapped into one space, which a lot of the artworks have a tendency of like getting, they land up sort of getting stuck in certain spaces because of the way they are built.
So it's really just to go out there and kind of the work to become
flow and learn,
to have a life of its own.
Have a life of its own and mutate and reach and
hopefully reach and that people learn.
Yeah. I mean, I would love for it to be AI generated, where people could plug in their own data sets and convert it into visual images and build their own composition. Because that's where this is going. That is what I'm aiming at.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, because there's a lot of data that you work with, especially in this project. So is there any kind of plans to make it kind of more AI based, because there's so much data?
I would love to, because the scrubbing of the data, just finding the right data took like a phenomenal amount of time. Took me it took a year to get like good data sets and then convert it into visual images. Yes, I would like to go in there, but this is on funding dependence. So I've been sort of collaborating with Mike from Timler, and he's been giving his time pro bono on this. And so it's sort of like when we get little funding. So I've got my basic funding from the Indian Foundation of the Arts, which helped me with all the research and the coding and programming and the development of the score. So I would just say, because see, if I go out in the real market, everybody wants to work on commercial projects. So I'm also competing with a lot of like, obviously people have to survive, and and fundings in India are not really that strong that could fund such heavy duty projects. So it's also like, you always work within limited resources, and when they give you a certain framework also to work within, I think it's really interesting how your limited resources correlate with building what really comes out also. And the questions that you'll end up asking through these restrictions, right?
Well, that's really interesting. Actually, well, maybe we should probably end the interview for the general public, but we can talk about this after. But yeah, I think I definitely see future in this kinds of development, especially now that so much is possible with AI and kind of generating large data sets and machine learning, and controlling that as well. That's a next issue, is I guess, is like how will you use it that it still makes meaningful sense to you.
And exactly. And these are what my projects like. How do you make meaningful sense out of all the data that's lying around you? But each one has to figure out their own correlation. And sometimes I feel like codependency on AI might reduce imagination to a certain extent, because humans have a draw chaos and are able to see beyond certain abstractions. We've been given, let's just say, these intuitive, or the sixth sense, we may call it, like, how knowledge sort of accumulates to become a certain sensibility. Similarly, I hope, like, I can sort of bring in a more intelligent format. And right now it's still in its nascent stages. So, and there is a lot of fake information being passed down also by AI. So I'm going to still wait for it till it becomes like AI. But right now, what I'm hoping is, like, even within the interaction, I can sort of, with that, or the Osmoscape, I can pull out the data sets, like the individual viewer can pull out their choice of data sets and sort of create a composition through that. So at least there is a creative endeavor that is happening with the already coexisting and valid data sets.
Cool, great. Well, thank you so much, Nandita, and it was so fascinating to hear about your work and the future plans for it. And yeah, so I will end the interview.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me for